Fade in. The sound of distant thunder. Wind sweeps through tall, whispering fields. Narrator, low, slow. They said the cotton in Lowndes County turned red one summer. Not from blight, not from dust, but from blood. In the year of our Lord 1851, Mississippi lay heavy under its own heat and sin. The land was rich, but the souls who worked it were not free. The whispers began with one name, murmured like a curse behind the barn doors, and beneath him songs. Caleb. He was unlike any other slave on the Withrow plantation. His skin pale as chalk, eyes like the sky before a storm. Born of sin, they said, a white man's cruelty made flesh in an albino child. The other slaves called him the ghost in the fields. When the overseer's whip found his back, it didn't bruise, it bled white. Not red, white, like milk and salt and snow. The master called him a devil. But the preacher said the devil didn't weep like that. Distant him fades in. Swing low, sweet chariot. That summer, something happened in those fields that the South would spend a century trying to forget. The man who owned those fields was Silas Withrow, a planter of cotton, tobacco, and wickedness. His wealth was built on the backs of the broken, and his pride on the illusion of order. Silas ruled with scripture and steel. His Bible was stained with tobacco, and his whip with faith. He fancied himself a patriarch, a god in suspenders. But every god hides a secret, and his was the ghost boy he kept out of sight. No one knew why he never sold Caleb. A boy like that, pale and strange, could have fetched a fine price in New Orleans. But Silas wouldn't let him go. Some say he feared him. Others say he loved him. There were nights the house staff swore they heard the master pacing, whispering prayers, and the floorboards creaking beneath bare feet, not his own. Thunder rolls. Candles flicker. By morning, the old man would sit at his breakfast table, eyes hollow as the empty fields beyond his porch. On the 3rd day of June, the sun rose wrong. The field hands found the cotton stained pink, the soil wet though it hadn't rained in days. The overseer cursed them for superstition, said the night dew mixed with clay, said the stains were nothing but dust. But when he touched the fibers, they stuck to his skin, thick and sweet like blood. Caleb stood among them, still as death, watching the color spread. Some say he smiled, though no joy lived in it. By noon, the stains had deepened to scarlet. By sundown, the overseer was found dead, throat open, his eyes rolled white as Caleb's own. The master buried him quick, no sermon, no marker. But the ground wouldn't keep quiet. That night, the cotton swayed though there was no wind, and the moon glowed red as fresh flesh. Low hum builds beneath narration, and from the veranda, Silas Withrow swore he saw a pale figure walking the rows, dragging something behind him that whispered like a chain. Reverend Amos Pike came riding from Vicksburg 3 days later, summoned by fear. The Withrow name had power in those parts, and when a plantation master called for cleansing, the church obeyed. The reverend found the place uneasy. Slaves prayed in silence. The white folk wouldn't look him in the eye. In the chapel, he met Caleb for the first time. The boy was sweeping the floor, barefoot, humming a hymn that no Christian had ever sung. The preacher asked where he learned it. Caleb looked up, his voice quiet as dust. From the field, sir. It sings when you bleed on it. Amos Pike wrote later in his journal that he'd seen evil in men, but never innocence so haunted. Faint children's voices echo, like distant choir humming wrong notes. The reverend stayed the night. He would not sleep again for 3 days. The following evening, Silas Withrow demanded baptism for his ghost child. Said he'd wash the curse from the boy with holy water and verse. They gathered in the chapel, thunder shaking the rafters. Caleb knelt in white rags, shivering, while the reverend poured from the bowl. But when the water touched his skin, it turned pink, then red, then black. The reverend dropped the basin, whispering, "Lord, forgive me." Caleb looked up, tears streaming pale down his face, and said only, "He won't." Silence. Then slow creak of wood as the church door swings open by itself. When they turned to look, the wind howled through the doorway. Outside, the cotton was no longer white. Thunder cracks. Fade to black. Fade in. A still night. Cicadas drone. The Withrow mansion looms under a pale moon. Narrator, low, solemn. After the baptism, the house changed. It didn't creak like homes do, it sighed. Doors opened by themselves. The mirrors clouded as if breathing. Mrs. Withrow, A fragile woman, long bedridden, began to speak names in her sleep, names no one had heard before. When her husband asked who they were, she said, "The ones under the floor." The servants found Caleb in the hallway each night, standing barefoot, staring toward the cotton fields. Sometimes he'd whisper, "They're calling for him." Silas tried to keep the house in order, sent for priests, for doctors, for whiskey. But nothing could quiet the groaning beneath the boards. The family Bible on his desk began to bleed through the edges, the ink running like veins. Low moan of wind through broken shutters. Some nights, the master swore he could hear his own name spoken from the cotton rows, stretched long and low like a prayer from the damned. By midsummer, the fields no longer shone white. The cotton had turned the color of rusted iron. Birds no longer sang. Even the insects were silent. Silas ordered his men to burn a portion of the crop, to cleanse it. They doused it with oil, struck a match, but the fire would not take. The overseers said the stalks were damp with morning dew, but when Silas knelt to touch them, his hand came back wet with blood. That night, the fields glowed faintly under the moon, shimmering with a strange, pale light. It was said that every cotton bloom pulsed, like a heartbeat. Camera pans slowly through the field. Soft human-sized whisper beneath the wind. The slaves refused to work. They said the field had mouths now, that when they stepped between the rows, the ground shifted like breathing flesh. Silas called it madness. But when he tried to enter himself, the wind stilled, and from the soil rose the faint sound of a baby crying. It was in that same room that Silas found his old ledgers, names, dates, prices, debts. Every life he had ever bought or broken was recorded there. But as he turned the pages, the ink began to move. Letters bled together, forming words he didn't write. His own name appeared again and again beside one word, debt. Then another line, paid in blood. Candle gutters. Paper rustles. Soft whispering fills the room. Silas stumbled back as the ink spread across the floorboards like veins in wood. His reflection in the window stared back at him, but its eyes were pale blue, not brown. For the first time, Silas Withrow prayed, not for salvation, but for silence. And from the field outside, Caleb's voice answered, "The Lord don't hear you no more." Thunder crashes. The candles die out one by one. The storm came on the 7th night after the baptism. It struck fast, tearing the shutters loose, flooding the house with wind and fear. Just past midnight, there were 7 knocks on the front door. Slow, even, heavy. Silas grabbed his pistol, trembling. The servants hid in the cellar. Mrs. Withrow lay frozen in bed, whispering, "Don't answer." The knocks came again, 7 exactly. When Silas opened the door, there was no one there. Only a trail of wet footprints leading into the parlor. Bare, pale feet that left behind no blood, no mud, only salt. Camera follows the footprints. The sound of slow breathing fills the silence. At the end of the trail, the piano lid lifted by itself. One note played, then another. The melody, a hymn Silas hadn't heard since he was a boy. From the shadows, Caleb's voice. He still remembers your mother's song. Lightning flash. Caleb stands at the edge of the room, eyes glowing faintly. The next morning, Silas began to write his confession. It was found years later, sealed behind the chapel wall, half-rotted, the ink burned into the page. He confessed not to murder, but to creation. "I made him," he wrote. "I took from the ones I owned what God forbade me to touch. I named him Caleb because I wanted to believe he was mine. But the Lord sees the roots of every crop, and this one was planted in sin." Soft rain fades. Silence deepens. He ended his letter with one final line. "If you see the cotton bleed white, it means he has come to collect." Candle sputters. Fade to black. Fade in. A muddy road under gray sky. Hooves splash through standing water. Narrator. Reverend Amos Pike rode back to the plantation before dawn. He'd dreamed of the boy every night since the baptism. Caleb's eyes open in the dark, mouth moving with no sound. He came armed not with faith, but fear. A Bible, a cross, and a flask of brandy. The mansion was half empty now. Most of the field hands had fled into the swamp. Those who remained wouldn't speak his name. They called Caleb the Pale Plague. Inside the chapel, Pike found the font dry and cracked black. He knelt to pray, but the echo that answered was not his own. "You can't wash off what was never clean," it whispered. Wind groans through broken glass. That was the moment the Reverend knew. This wasn't a haunting. It was a harvest. Each night the field sang, a low hum like the earth remembering pain. Caleb walked among the rows, barefoot, his hands brushing the blooms. Where he passed, the cotton grew paler, as if drained of something deep within. The slaves called it bleeding white. They said the boy was siphoning the master's soul through the roots. Inside the manor, Silas Withrow coughed up foam and salt. His skin grew paler by the hour, veins thinning like parchment. He was becoming what he had created. Soft moan of wind through shutters. When the Reverend saw him, he fell to his knees. Silas's eyes were milk white, pupils gone. He smiled through cracked lips. He ain't my curse no more, preacher. He's yours. Desperate, the Reverend prepared an exorcism from memory and myth. He spoke of Leviathan, of blood that turns white, of angels that refuse to die. Caleb stood at the door, silent, eyes shining. The Reverend raised his Bible, voice breaking. Spirit, return to dust. The boy laughed once, a sound like wind through bones. I am dust. Thunder cracks. Salt line scatters. The candles burst into white flame. On the walls, shadows writhed like coiling serpents, each one bearing a human face. The Reverend saw his own among them. He fled into the night, cross still smoldering in his hand. Behind him, the chapel collapsed, burning without smoke. Upstairs, Mrs. Withrow could no longer speak the Lord's name. Her mirror refused to show her face. Instead, it showed the cotton field, endless, rippling like a sea of skin. She saw Caleb walking there, and behind him, 100 pale shapes rising from the rows. Children, women, men, their eyes glowing blue. Mirror shatters off screen. When Silas found her, she was standing before the broken glass, smiling softly. She said, "He forgave them first." Then she fell forward, white dust pouring from her mouth. By the time she hit the floor, there was nothing left but cloth and ashes. At the end of summer, there was no one left to pick the cotton. But the bowls burst anyway, spilling not fiber but salt. Mountains of it. The Reverend returned one final time, driven by guilt and madness. He found the field empty except for Caleb, kneeling beside a dead tree. The boy looked up, smiling through tears. It's done, sir. The land remembers. Camera closes in on Caleb's face. The ground beneath him split open, and white light poured out, not bright, but cold, like a wound in the world. When the Reverend blinked, the boy was gone. Only the salt remained, rising in the breeze like ashes from a long-forgotten fire. Fade to black. Sound of soft breathing. Fade in. Charred paper drifting through the air. The house stands gutted, windows hollow. Narrator, low, steady. Weeks later, a traveler from Natchez found the Withrow estate burned to the bones. No sign of life. Only a desk half buried in salt. Inside that desk was a single page from Silas Withrow's ledger. Most of the ink was gone, but at the bottom, in pale gray lines, someone had written, "Forgive the field, not the man." Wind hisses through open beams. The traveler swore the air still tasted sweet, like sugar and iron. He gathered the page, folded it, and rode away. He didn't notice the faint white dust that clung to his hands and refused to wash off. Reverend Pike preached one final sermon that autumn. He spoke of blood that forgets its color, of a sin so deep it bleaches everything it touches. The congregation said his voice cracked halfway through. He fell to his knees, weeping salt instead of tears. They buried him behind the church, but when the grave was opened years later after a flood, the coffin was empty. Only a crust of white powder where his bones should have been. Soft hymn hums under narration. People said he'd joined the soil he tried to save. Time buried the Withrow name. The plantation changed hands, became timberland, then a subdivision that never quite took root. Locals call it Ghost Acre. No matter what's planted there, corn, pine, kudzu, the soil turns pale within weeks. Sometimes, when it rains, the puddles fill not with mud but with milky water. Children dare each other to touch it. Animals refuse to drink. And once every few decades, during a red moon, the cotton sprouts again, white as bone, though no seed was ever sown. Camera pans across the wet field. A single set of bare footprints forms, one after another, then fades. In 1937, during a WPA folklore survey, a historian found a sealed letter marked, "Do not open until the soil runs white." Inside were the words of a woman claiming to be the last of the Withrows. She wrote that her family still woke to find salt on their windowsills. She begged the government to bless the land, to plow it under with holy earth. Her plea was filed away, forgotten. The letter still sits in the Mississippi State Archives, its paper stiff and grainy. Archivists say if you hold it too long, it leaves a white print on your fingers, like frostburn. They say on windless nights you can still see him, Caleb, walking the rows where the cotton once bled red, then white. He doesn't haunt for vengeance. He walks to remind, to whisper that blood, no matter its color, never leaves the earth, it only changes shade. Low organ note swells. The legend says that when the fields glow pale again, it means the debt of that soil has come due. And somewhere, beneath the roots, a boy with sky-blue eyes is still waiting for someone to say his name without fear. Camera drifts upward. White fog swallows the land. Narrator, final line, a whisper. Mississippi never forgets her ghosts, she just plants over them. Fade to black. Slow hymn echoes. Screen text. The Withrow Plantation, Lowndes County. Records lost 1852.